Okay then. Hello and welcome to episode 188 of the best show on YouTube that has zero production values. I'm your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. And 188, of course, is not prime. It is, in fact, 2 times 2 times 47. Pretty sure 47 is prime. And before I wade into these questions, I suppose I should announce again that my fourth book, Memoirs from Myanmar, which is primarily autobiographical, philosophical reflections on the monk's life, mainly in Burma, but also including Indonesia and the United States. So that's available on Amazon, and you can find it in the URL links below if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And if you are interested, then I would appreciate a review if you do purchase and read the book, especially if it's a good review. And I would also like to announce, just for the hell of it, that I started a new job just last week, and I'm back working in a metal shop again. It turns out that working in a metal shop is less unpleasant than being a professional forklift operator, which is kind of surprising, but that's the way it turned out. And my employment situation is still a little bit up in the air because after I've been working at this new place for 3 days, I get this email from some company I applied to probably more than a month ago saying, would you be willing to accept $8 an hour more than, they didn't know how much I was making at this new place, but they were offering $8 an hour more. And I did the math, and it turns out that adds up to, based on a 40-hour week, that adds up to more than $16,000 a year. So I'm kind of hoping that they don't follow through and once and for all offer me this job, because I just feel like I'm already kind of committed to this other job. But $16,000 a year plus is nothing to sneeze your nose at. So, it has to be considered if they do offer it. Just the way it goes. So let's see here. I guess with that as a kind of intro, did I mention this show has zero production values? At least, these little paper umbrellas they're not free, you know. Anyways, let's just start answering questions. And the first question is from Gordon. And Gordon says, you mentioned the Catholic explanation for the lack of progress you were experiencing. Is there a Theravada explanation? If so, what was it? And Gordon is referring to me in the previous Q&A, I think, talking about how I was kind of like Godhika in the Godhika Sutta, where he would get jhana and lose it and get it and lose it and get it and lose it until he was at wit's end. And I was kind of like that with my meditation too. It's like I would get into deep meditative states and then lose it and then gain it and lose it and gain it and lose it. And St. John of the Cross, the mystical doctor of the Catholic Church, said, based on his own experience with what the Catholics called contemplation, which is essentially anything higher than first jhana from a Buddhist point of view, it seems to me. Now, you're not thinking anymore. There's no longer any kind of perceptual object, no labeling, no thinking. And he said that if you gain it and lose it and gain it and lose it and gain it and lose it, that just means that God has other plans for you than for you to be an adept, which would be kind of the Catholic equivalent of what a Theravada Buddhist would call an Arya. So, Gordon here is asking if there's a Theravada explanation, and the reason why I gave the Catholic explanation is because I am unaware of any official Theravada explanation other than just you've got karmic complications. You've got these latent tendencies that are standing in the way. You're not, fully established in the root virtues necessary to completely master deep meditative states. So, I mean, a lot of people try for years and years and years and never even get into deep meditative states. So at least I was able to get them. It's just that I never fully mastered it, so that, once you've mastered it, it's like pretty much any time you want to, you can just sit down and go into these deep meditative states. And in my case, it didn't work out that way. So, yeah, I mean, the Theravada explanation would just be karmic complications, I guess. And I'm just going to move on to Gordon's second question. He says, regarding the Terence McKenna quotation about drugs being an instant spiritual experience, it doesn't seem like you really disagreed with it. Is doing LSD the same thing as an actual spiritual experience? Well, it depends on the experiencer and the experience itself. But yeah, I mean, most of the monks of my generation started off with like psychedelic drugs, like Ram Dass, formerly known as Dr. Richard Alpert of Harvard University, also started off with psychedelic drugs. And then they started, first it like opens your eyes to these new possibilities that, the version of reality that you've been living in your whole life isn't necessarily the best or truest version of reality. So it kind of like at least makes you aware of that. And in a case like that, all sorts of things could be a genuine spiritual experience. Getting hit over the head, if it causes you to have a near-death experience, which then causes you to see the world differently, that's an actual or genuine spiritual experience. You can have a genuine spiritual experience from looking at a dog licking its own balls. So, yeah, sure. I think for some people, for a lot of people, taking LSD would be a genuine spiritual experience if it is inducing like mystical states or like profound insights. And just because you think it's a profound insight at the time doesn't mean that when you like are back into the ordinary waking consciousness, it's going to still seem like a profound insight. But just the very fact that you can have these experiences, which is like giving you firsthand experience, just firsthand empirical facts that the way that you've been living your life, like the ordinary waking state of consciousness, is not the only possible state. That, let's see. It's not necessarily even the truest state. So, let's see. Let's get back to the actual question here, though. Is doing LSD the same thing as an actual spiritual experience? It can be, and in many cases it is. If it's like inducing mystical states, which was the case like with me the first many times I took it as a teenager. It was largely that sort of thing that eventually got me on the path to becoming a monk, and that was the case with many monks of my generation. I don't know what it's like now. A lot of old hippies became monks because of that sort of thing. So, sure. And I discussed this in the previous Q&A also to some degree. So I'm not going to just rehash the same arguments and so forth. But yeah, the Terence McKenna quotation that I was responding to in the previous Q&A, he seemed to have this idea of like, it's kind of a cheat. It's like you're cheating God or something by attaining just in a matter of half an hour after taking a tab of LSD, what a lot of like renunciants are striving for years and decades, and some of them never succeed in getting into as profound of a mental state as some person can get from taking 500 micrograms of LSD. So it seems almost like a cheat, or it seems like unfair somehow, but it still works. So that was what really struck me. I wasn't going along the lines of Terence McKenna saying that, it's like using psychedelics is sort of like forcing God to do your bidding. I addressed that in the previous Q&A, but it does seem like it's just almost cheating, that it's so easy this way, whereas following the traditional spiritual techniques fasting and praying and meditating and renunciation and all that is not as reliable as just taking this little square of paper. It's just the way it turned out. But don't look a gift horse in the mouth, I guess. So I'm just going to move on to Gordon's next question. Not that I am advising anyone to take illegal drugs. That's a disclaimer. Gordon's third question. And judging from this third question, he seems to be rather skeptical of the whole idea. He says, if you went back in time and showed the Buddha LSD, would he say, oh yeah, that's what I was trying to do the whole time, just better, and then ditch all his teaching and spend the rest of his life sitting on the couch, eating Cheetos and getting blasted? I have a hard time believing he would do this. Yeah, I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's just such an obvious false dichotomy. You know, it's just sophistry at best to frame it this way. But, I mean, like, Neem Karoli Baba up there notoriously took, first it was 900 micrograms of very pure pharmaceutical grade LSD. And then after that, he took 1,200 micrograms, which is enough to just blow the top off of somebody's head. And it had no obvious discernible effect on him. Because he was such a master of his mind, I guess. Such a swami. That, I mean, it just didn't really have that much effect on him, if any. But he did say that under certain circumstances, this kind of thing can be useful. If you take it in a place that isn't very hot and you take it like alone in a quiet place, this kind of thing. He did give advice with regard to it. Well, let's see. If the Buddha took LSD, I mean, second guessing a fully enlightened being, it's a common theme in questions I receive. But still, it's just an exercise in futility. But let's see. If you went back in time and showed the Buddha LSD, would he say, oh yeah, that's what I was trying to do the whole time, but better? But no, it's not better. I mean, it's better if you can do it without having to rely on the chemical. And also, you get into purer states because the chemical is going to have weird side effects, like the psychedelic visuals and that kind of stuff. That is unnecessary. That can be a distraction. Just the euphoric rush and all this kind of thing. I mean, that just kind of gets in the way, or at least it can. So if you're doing it through meditation or contemplation, as the Catholics call it, you get into, if you master or just get really good at it, you get into deeper, better states. Like, I got into deeper, better states through meditation as a monk, alone in a cave in Burma, than I got from LSD. I wouldn't have been in that cave in Burma if I hadn't taken the LSD, probably. But that's a different matter. And the LSD, like I say, it's got these sort of impurities in the state, or just distractions added, like, you know, psychedelic visuals and kind of the weird distortions of perception. And that may be one of the ways that psychedelics work, is it just kind of interferes with perception, distorts it to such an extent that you're kind of like seeing through the cracks. You know, it's making like deformities in the normal process of perception, in a sense, you know, so to speak, so that you're kind of able to see through it. But I mean, it's just kind of like training wheels or something. I mean, if really LSD was better than living the holy life, it wouldn't have caused all these people to just become monks as a result of taking the LSD. The LSD is just kind of like a peek into what is possible. And then having the Buddha spend the rest, ditch all of his teachings, which he wouldn't do. I mean, the Four Noble Truths remain true regardless of whether LSD exists or not. And spend the rest of his life sitting on the couch eating Cheetos and getting blasted. Well, they didn't have Cheetos in the Buddha's time. But I mean, it just doesn't make any sense why the Buddha would do that. I mean, the teachings of the Buddha are true regardless of whether LSD can inspire a genuine spiritual experience or a genuine mystical state. So yeah, I have a hard time believing he would do that too. I don't think he would do that at all, any more than Neem Karoli Baba up there. after taking 900 micrograms and then on a different occasion 1200 micrograms of LSD, he didn't just renounce being a holy man, partly because what he had experienced was superior to the effects of the LSD. But still, he did point out that it can be useful. It can be a genuine spiritual tool. Not that I am promoting the taking of illegal drugs. So, let's just move on to the next question here. This is from Crash Meta Religion. And Crash Meta Religion says, I consider myself a Neoplatonist religious syncretist. I often wonder what the future of the West will be from a religious standpoint. That's what he says, standpoint. Assuming the West isn't destroyed, what do you think it will look like? I think a society where evangelical Christianity is replaced by Hindu, Buddhist, and neo-pagan religions alongside of a more tolerant Christian mystical tradition would be a good thing. I don't see Western man ditching Christianity, but I hope they embrace more mystical and less dogmatic versions of it. And yeah, I've been asked, what I think the future of religion and spirituality will be in America or in Western civilization or in global civilization. And it's really hard to say. It's sort of like a butterfly effect. You can't really predict, or at least I can't really predict, partly because it's going to depend a lot. Like if there is a new religion founded by some charismatic, enlightened founder or someone who is charismatic enough to compensate for the fact that he isn't really enlightened, which has happened, then, there's no telling where he's going to be born. He could be born in New York City or Uganda or China or who knows. And what his cultural conditioning is going to be, that he's going to grow up in, is going to very much influence what his teachings are going to be like. And so I can't predict what culture the next enlightened founder of a religion or semi-enlightened, charismatic founder of religion, what culture he's going to be born into. And one thing that immediately came to mind when I saw this question, when I read this question the first time, is a relatively common theme in the writings of Brian Aldiss, who was a science fiction author back in the 60s and 70s especially. And one of his favorite themes was, in a future age, a new religion will be based on omniscient computers. That everybody's going to carry around this little computer with them that's going to be sort of like their idol. And they're just going to consult the AI, and the AI is going to be much more advanced than now. It's going to be effectively omniscient. And so you're just going to have this altar with an omniscient computer on it, and you're going to be consulting that computer as for guidance in your life. And that wouldn't be completely surprising to me, that AI gets advanced enough that it's going to become like an oracle. Already I consult Grok a lot with regard to all sorts of things, with regard to aquarium keeping or ancient history or just recent politics, that kind of stuff. So, if it gets way more advanced, you get into super AI that, it becomes effectively omniscient, at least in certain respects, then it could be that the next world religion is just going to be having effectively, practically omniscient computers serving as oracles. Instead of going all the way to the Oracle of Delphi, having the Pythoness jabber in a drug-induced state with priests kind of deciphering the jabbering and then presenting you with some enigmatic statement. After you've purified yourself and made the sacrifices and all that, you just go to your altar, consult the oracle, and you probably get more reliable information. But let's say that omniscient computers aren't going to be the religion of the future. It's really hard to say. Already, especially on the left, you gotta give the devil its due. That the liberals especially starting with the boomer generation, they became more eclectic. They didn't want to be stuffy conservative Christians like their parents. So they started investigating Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, paganism, Wicca, that kind of stuff, partly just in order not to be similar to their parents. And also just taking the psychedelic drugs that the hippies were notorious for might have helped them to go in that kind of direction. There's still a lot of Christianity, but generally Christianity is more of a conservative thing. And yeah, so I'm not exactly sure where to go with this. Christianity, I mean, it seems to me that as a legitimate spiritual force in world culture, it has pretty much exhausted itself. I mean, there are still a lot of devout, serious Christians out there, but it's just a pale shadow compared with just a few hundred years ago. So it wouldn't surprise me if Christianity is largely replaced by some new system, preferably not Islam. I mean, you'd have to have something that would have sophistication, assuming that people just don't get so dumbed down that they can just revert to like really primitive, superstitious kind of religions. But this question is hard to answer because, again, there's like the butterfly effect. Who knows where the next like enlightened or just charismatic spiritual leader will be born? What culture? What culture is going to be pervading what he is teaching? You know, what kind of cultural conditioning? If he's born in the West, he could be like an Eckhart Tolle type. But people like Eckhart Tolle, they're just too eclectic and in a way kind of too lukewarm to really get the ball rolling with like a new religious movement. And it's going to take certain characteristics, I think, in society to allow a new religion to arise, because it's like there has to be a kind of crisis point where they cannot accept their old cultural conditioning as much anymore. They're looking for something different. And that is when, you know, the charismatic leader has to arise that then just starts this whole new religious movement going. And it's almost impossible to predict with any kind of certainty exactly how that's going to happen. Like Christianity, it was like classical paganism had just kind of run its course. People didn't really believe in it anymore. They're just kind of going through the motions with it, or at least enough of them were that, you know, it had lost its soul, so to speak. And Christianity seems to be doing that also, although, of course, there are still devout Christians, just as when Christianity was arising, like 3rd, 4th century Roman Empire, you still have a lot of devout pagans too. And I don't think Christianity will ever be completely replaced. Maybe it will, but I don't know. You know, science has largely replaced Christianity as the explanation of reality. Christianity, even devout Christians, generally have more faith in science than they have in like interpreting the Bible to explain why things are as they are, other than just God made it. But he made it according to like scientific rules, this kind of thing. So where's the actual question mark here? Assuming the West isn't destroyed, what do you think it will look like? Which is the future of the West from a religious standpoint. The future of the West from a religious standpoint, what will it look like? I mean, there has to be some kind of unifying belief system. Any society that does not have a unifying belief system it's just going to disintegrate. And America kind of moved away from religion and adopted a kind of civic nationalism. You know, everyone had the shared values of freedom and equality and so forth. But I'm not exactly sure. I mean, it could be some kind of spiritual, scientific kind of mysticism even. But if I had to make a guess, it's either going to be some charismatic leader who hopefully is wise, or it's going to be like the Brian Aldiss scenario of people consulting practically omniscient computers as oracles. But I mean, again, there's such chaos theory involved in this, such a butterfly effect, depending on where the next religious guru is going to arise, the charismatic leader who's going to start a world religion. Who can say? So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo, and I'm just checking to make sure we're recording. Yeah, we are. We are recording. Romeo says, I see so many similar tendencies. Okay. I see so many similar tendencies, both physically and emotionally, in members of my family. I understand this from a scientific, genetic, hereditary perspective, but I was wondering if there is a spiritual component as well. Do you think there is such a thing as inherited collective karma in families? How about more broadly in nations, races, cultures, etc.? Aside from your opinion, what is the Buddhist perspective on inherited collective karma? Okay, let's start with the Buddhist perspective. Buddhism just rejects the idea of group karma. It's kind of like the controversy in evolutionary biology, where you've got some evolutionary biologists saying that it is only at the individual level that evolution occurs. The individual is successful in reproducing his genes or not. And so like a population, this kind of thing, it's just kind of like an illusion that populations evolve aside from just at the individual level, the individual organism reproduces or fails to reproduce, or reproduces more or reproduces less or not at all, etc. But then there are some evolutionary biologists, and I can relate to this. I really do not fully comprehend the argument that you cannot have group evolution, like the evolution of a population. I mean, obviously, societies evolve, and a society is like a group of individuals. It's a population. So culture obviously can have a group effect, like an alphabet or a language can evolve that isn't just at the individual level, like the individual speaks that language or doesn't speak that language. But I can kind of appreciate the Theravada Buddhist explanation of how there seems to be group karma without there really being group karma. And that is, for example, individuals, just using the term individual, even though in Buddhism there is no self, no soul that reincarnates, anything like that. But you've got like these sort of currents of karmic momentum. And in order to be born into a family, you have to have like similar karma to them in order to be experiencing the same kind of things. And also it may be that at least some of your family members, I mean, you have like a multi-life relationship going. Like Edgar Cayce used to say that we tend to have a strong karmic relation to one of our parents, but usually not both. So in that case, I had more of a karmic relationship with my father than with my mother. But still, you can't wind up in a family unless your karma is compatible with that. Similar with a culture. It's like lately, during the course of my lifetime, people have referred to like the Middle East is just a hotbed of violence and war. It's just been a battlefield since prehistoric times, literally. And so they will use that as an example of like group karma or regional karma. But I mean, you can just interpret that from the more Buddhistic, more orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, in that if you have that kind of karma, then you're just going to be reborn in that kind of society, in that part of the world. So it's just more of certain cultures attract certain people with certain karmic dispositions and needs and requirements and so forth. More than other cultures. So, I mean, it's not necessary to have group karma in order to explain like the karmic similarities of members of a family or the karmic similarities of members of a nation or a society. It's just that if you have this kind of karma, you're going to be reborn into this kind of family, or you're going to be born into this kind of society. So, I mean, I can kind of accept the Buddhist explanation that there is no such thing as group karma. With regard to evolution, I think that there might be group evolution in a sense, but I can't accept that, it's subjective. Morality is subjective and your karma is subjective, even though ultimately there's no subject. That's just kind of a virtual reality. It's because this whole world is a virtual reality. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to go with the idea that just beings or, karmic streams that have similar requirements with regard to their karma just wind up together. That it's not the group karma. It's just that my individual karma fits in with this other individual's karma. That our karma is going to be reach fruition more effectively by us being together, and so it just happens that way naturally. That would be the official Theravada Buddhist explanation, and I am inclined to go along with that. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Theravadin and Sipat. And Theravadin and Sipat specializes in sending me like a screenshot of this big block of text and asking me to respond to that, or sending me a video, thoughts, this kind of stuff. So he's kind of done that in this episode. He says, if enlightenment doesn't require the ending of desire, so someone like Krishnamurti can have sex with his friend's wife and be considered enlightened, but just going with the flow of karma, then wouldn't someone like this be the ultimate enlightened being, living only in the present moment with no past or future, but just going with the flow of karma? And then parentheses, he says, you can replace the racial words with people for the video. I didn't mean it in a racist way, but rather just the idea behind it. And he sends me, it's like 4 paragraphs that contain, well, I mean, I won't even say what the racial slur is. I mean, it's an extremely derogatory racial slur that is found probably 50 times, many times in this little block of language. And he's talking about certain people who, I mean, they really do not identify with their future self or presumably their past self. They're just living in the moment. And so they have no regard for consequences. It's like, I've thought about this with regard to like devil worshippers, where they're willing to sell their soul, just going with the stereotype. They sell their soul to the devil. They're willing to burn in hell forever and ever in exchange for, say, 10 years of fame and wealth and pleasure, which is just like an absurd, bad deal. But a lot of people are willing to go with that. So it's like they don't even have sympathy or empathy for their own future self, much less anybody else. But it's like, in a way, it's just like the extreme of this sort of selfishness where you don't even care about your future self. It's just me now, which strikes me as particularly foolish. But anyways, you've got a person who's just living in the present moment, like an animal. I mean, why not just say animals? Why bring certain groups of people into this when you could just say animals? And animals, like a dog, or like there's a dog that just came in. They just live in the present moment. And Eckhart Tolle says that animals are in a way enlightened, except for a few domesticated animals that have become neurotic through too much intimate contact with the neuroses of human beings. But for the most part, according to Eckhart Tolle in his famous book, The Power of Now, most animals are enlightened. But it's a different kind of enlightenment from like the enlightenment of Gautama Buddha, for example. It's like Gautama Buddha is like this more comprehensive kind of enlightenment, whereas the enlightenment of an animal is just sort of limited within the context. It's still, from the Buddhist point of view, animals are in a lower realm. They're not enlightened at all. But at least they're in the present moment. They're not creating a bunch of unnecessary suffering for themselves by worrying about the future or feeling regrets about the past or wondering what's going on, like what the neighbors are thinking, that kind of stuff. So in a way, animals, they have less delusion and foolishness than we do, partly just because we have bigger minds that can hold more of it. Like a cow is just keeps 5 precepts pretty much effortlessly and just seems pretty placid and serene most of the time. And from the Buddhist point of view, a cow is not fully enlightened. But Theravadin and Zen here really isn't talking about a Buddhist conception of enlightenment unless you're getting into like the tantric stuff or some of those Zen masters. You know, some of those Zen masters, they were kind of getting into the realm of Krishnamurti. So, let's see. Theravadin and Zen says, if enlightenment doesn't require the ending of desire. There's different ways of ending desire. One way of ending it is just to transcend it and, in a way, sort of transmute it, denature it, which is what I keep talking about, and people just do not get it. That you can transcend it. It's like you're watching a movie. It's like a suspenseful, scary kind of movie. And I mean, your heart's beating faster. You know, you're kind of on the edge of your seat because, you know, the person in the movie might get killed in some horrible way. And then you just remind yourself, it's just a movie. That doesn't stop the stuff from happening. It's just that you have just kind of risen to a higher level. You know, King Lear raging at the storm, going mad with grief. I mean, at one level, it's King Lear going mad with grief out on the heath in the storm. But at another level, it's this actor who's just saying his lines, you know? And I mean, enlightenment can work that way, where you're still apparently like wallowing in samsara, but your consciousness has just risen above that level. So, I mean, some people just do not and cannot get this kind of stuff where you're talking about 2 different levels of reality simultaneously. It just does not work. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, in the case of like Krishnamurti, just going just for the sake of argument, let's just say Jiddu Krishnamurti was really an enlightened being, even though he messed around with his personal secretary's wife. He wore a toupee. You know, he did stuff that a fully enlightened being stereotypically, traditionally isn't supposed to do. But if you just assume that he just was at a higher level of consciousness, the shit that's supposedly happening in samsara is still happening, but he's not identifying with it anymore. So the desire, you know, at like a subjective level, maybe, but he's not being subjective anymore, just going with the argument. So, you know, there's still desire, but he's just not identified with that anymore. And even like a fully enlightened being like the Buddha, I mean, he still had, apparently, if we can believe the texts, he still had like preferences. You know, he still had to have motives for his behavior, which could be considered a kind of desire. And it's just that, I mean, when you're an enlightened being, you're just not identified with this stuff anymore. And it's like this 2-dimensional thinking that just cannot comprehend the idea that you're just going to transcend samsara with samsara still being here without being stuck in it and by identifying with it anymore. So it's a matter of perspective. So let's see here. Where's the question? Okay. Wouldn't someone like this, you know, or like, let's just say an animal, be the ultimate enlightened being, living only in the present moment with no past or future, but just going with the flow of karma? Well, I mean, because they're still deluded, they're still creating new karma, which an enlightened being doesn't do. So that would be like one technical difference between, like, say, an animal who's totally in the present moment. They're still creating karma. They still have desires and attachments and so forth. They haven't really risen above it. supposedly a fully enlightened being is not creating new karma. There's still the old karma that's working itself out until the enlightened being dies. But they're not creating new karma by what they're doing, even though there may still be some kind of vestigial desires and stuff going on. It's just that they have risen above that. They're not identifying with it anymore. I mean, if they had totally risen above karma to the extent of just eliminating it, they wouldn't have anything even happening to them. Which gets into a whole different kind of argument. I mean, you're straying from the realm of Theravada Buddhism by giving the idea that, a fully enlightened being isn't even really here. They're just, our own karma is like projecting the semblance of some enlightened being out there, but they don't have any karma sustaining themselves. It's all just generated by the karma of unenlightened beings who need this kind of enlightened teacher, to fulfill their own karma. But that's getting kind of complicated and confusing, isn't it? But say a baby or an animal, they're not the ultimate enlightened being, even though they may be in the present moment. They might not be thinking in words. They still have latent tendencies that really they haven't freed themselves from. Not even through transcendence. But it's hard to explain, which is probably one reason why so few people really understand it. But you get into like the Zen masters and some of the tantric Tibetan teachers and so forth. It's the same kind of a deal. I mean, it's getting closer to Buddhism, but it's it's just a matter of transcending samsara. You don't just eliminate samsara when you become enlightened. You rise above samsara in a sense. You stop identifying with it. You're operating at a higher level of consciousness that still might include this samsaric stuff, but it's just not you anymore. And it's hard to understand, which is why so many people don't understand it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Siovac Sipad Zidana. He says, and I quote, "There are Jataka tales of the Buddha giving his wife and kids away, letting animals eat him when he was a rabbit, and many other tales of extreme charity. I can't tell how the bodhisattva ideal is any different than being a suicidal, empathy-ridden leftist, because all three of the above situations are mocking the attitudes of leftists if taken to its ultimate conclusion, and it looks less extreme than bodhisattva activities. Please explain." Well, I will say the Jataka story of the Buddha who was, in a previous life, a wise hare, the Sasa Jataka it's called. He wasn't throwing himself into the fire to cook himself for the sake of other animals. It was just that Saka, king of gods, disguised himself as a Brahmin holy man. And so the rabbit, or the hare, had decided in advance that day that if any kind of wandering holy man came by, he was going to offer him food. And then he realized wandering holy men don't eat clover or whatever like rabbits do. So he was going to just immolate himself, cook his own meat to offer to this Brahmin holy man. And it turned out that it was Saka, king of gods, disguised as a holy man, just testing this hare. And as a result of that, the rabbit really did fling himself into the fire to cook himself so that this holy man could eat the rabbit meat. And because it was really Saka, king of gods, or formerly known as Indra, he caused the rabbit not to be burned by the fire, and then rewarded that hare by taking the juice of a mountain, squeezing the juice out of a mountain, and making the image of a rabbit, the hare, on the surface of the moon. So in like ancient Indian Buddhism, there was no man in the moon. It was the hare in the moon. And if you look, it does seem like it really is a rabbit. It's just kind of turned sideways. But it's like the man in the moon, like one of his eyes has like these two streaks coming out. Those are the ears of the rabbit. So Some people have used that to argue that the Buddha is the man in the moon. But I digress. Some of these tales of like the Buddha in a previous life, or some arahant, or some other wise being, just giving away their own wife and children, for example. Like there's that completely Monty Python-esque biography of Mangala Buddha that's found in the Buddha Vamsa and its commentaries, where Mangala Buddha, in a previous life, before he was the Buddha, he was a bodhisattva. He gave away his kids to an ogre disguised as a Brahmin. And then the ogre just starts eating his kids, the kids of the bodhisattva. And the bodhisattva, instead of being alarmed by an ogre eating his children, he was rejoicing. He was delighted at his superhuman act of charity, giving away his own kids to be devoured by an ogre. And it's that kind of stuff. I mean, it's just completely leaving reality behind. You know, it's just making like a complete extreme case for, I mean, partly it's glorification of the founder of a religion. Like he is capable of this level of generosity or virtue or whatever that leaves ordinary human beings far behind. It's just as a way of glorifying this person. But it just makes them a kind of monster in a certain way. I mean, there is one story of the Buddha in a previous life. I don't remember if it's a Godhika story or if it's just in the commentary somewhere, where he was a farmer and he had his little boy come with him out into the fields. And his little boy was just playing in the shade of a tree while the father, the bodhisattva, was plowing the fields. And so the father, you know, he's glancing over at his kid to make sure the kid's okay, because, you know, he's a father. And then at one point he notices the little kid is just lying motionless on the ground. So he hurries over and finds out that the little kid has been bitten by a snake and is no longer alive. So what the bodhisattva does, I mean, he can't save the kid. The field still needs to be plowed. So he just finishes his plowing before taking the body of his child back to the village. And I mean, that maybe is kind of believable. I mean, that could be indicative of some kind of wisdom, maybe. But I mean, giving your own kids away and rejoicing as an ogre devours them, I mean, that is just not human at all. That's just like a made up, silly story. And you can find lots of those in the text, especially like in the commentarial tradition. It's like people get so caught up in the religious mindset, the devotionalistic religious mindset, that they just kind of leave common sense reality behind. So what's the actual question here? Let's see. I can't tell how the bodhisattva ideal, going with Theravada, is any different than being a suicidal, empathy-ridden leftist. You're not supposed to say that S word on YouTube, I'm pretty sure. Because all three of the above situations are mocking the attitudes of leftists. Yeah, it's like the reductio ad absurdum. If taken to its ultimate conclusion, and it looks less extreme than bodhisattva activities. I mean, yeah, I guess the one kind of saving grace of Buddhism is that you're supposed to completely renounce society to do this kind of stuff. I mean, you cannot really be a functioning member of society and then just like give your kids away to ogres to be eaten, that kind of thing. I mean, kind of, it says it was that way in the texts or in the commentary or whatever, but yeah, a society is not going to work if that kind of stuff goes mainstream. So yeah, I mean, both of these are just a case of like virtue-oriented idealism just going to its logical extreme until you have left practical reality far behind in the dust. So, I mean, I don't know if there's really all that much more I can say about this. But it's just silly stories that you're going to find in ancient Pali texts or medieval Pali commentaries. And there's quite a lot of silly stuff in there if you look for it. But I mean, maybe if you are a fully enlightened being or very close, you're a very advanced saint, you may be able to get away with some of this stuff. Like one example that's a famous Zen story. You've got this Zen monk who's living in some hut out in the woods, and a robber comes in, and the robber's going to steal, this monk's stuff. And the monk asks him to leave a little bit of money, because it's okay for Zen monks to handle money because he needs it for something. And then the robber just, for whatever reason, I think most robbers wouldn't do it, but this robber, just leaves a little bit of money like the monk asked and takes the rest. And then as he's leaving, the monk is like looking out the window at the full moon and thinking, it's a pity I couldn't give him this beautiful full moon. This kind of question, which might also be just like some made up legend. But like a saint can maybe do that kind of stuff, but a society cannot run on principles like this. People are selfish because there is survival value, evolutionary survival value in being selfish. For example, if you're a saint, maybe you can indulge in a certain amount of virtuous extremism, but a society just isn't going to work on principles like that, not for very long anyhow. So I'm just going to move on to Theravadin and Sipadzena's next question. He says, I was watching this video, and the video is about men being more likely to die of a broken heart than women are. And then he continues, I'm guessing he's speaking about American culture and maybe his Indian culture, since he mentioned biology. I want to know whether you think this is a genetic flaw in males, or if it is a kind of cultural sickness and not present in places like Burma. Or maybe it is a modern trend. I want to know your thoughts on the subject, because it seems clearly maladaptive and kind of pathetic, I have to say. And Theravadin and Sipadzeina is just black-pilled and sees everything through a lens of negativity. Anyways, so yeah, it's there's this little video where some person, maybe a doctor, is talking about how men are more likely literally to die of a broken heart, like to die of heart failure after a divorce, or just lose the will to live and just give up after your mate dies when you're both very old. Like Jimmy Stewart was like that, the famous actor Jimmy Stewart. He loved his wife very much. They were very happy together, apparently. And after she passed away, it was sort of like a male swan or a crane or a stork or something that mate for life. And once he lost his mate, he just kind of moped and just kind of went downhill and died just a few weeks later. And it's this way in Burma also. Like I've probably mentioned this before, the stereotypical tearjerker romance movie in Burma that you see when riding the bus between Mandalay and Rangoon. You got to watch these cheesy Burmese movies. And just the standard theme of some Burmese romance movie. There's no telling how many dozens of these movies have been made following this same template. You've got a young man of lower social status falls in love with the rich girl, and they love each other just deliriously, and then they kind of run off together. But the father of the girl absolutely will not stand for his daughter marrying this, he's like some street vendor or something, some bike shaw driver. So like the girl's elder brothers or just some goons hired by the father seek them out, beat the shit out of the guy, and drag the girl home again. And the father requires her to marry some rich guy who's a complete asshole. So what happens is, the guy who, the man and the woman, they loved each other. They get separated. The man drinks himself to death, usually drinking Johnny Walker Red Label, which probably helps to account for the early decease of this fellow. Whereas the girl boo-hoos for a few days and then winds up marrying the rich guy that her father required her to marry. And I do think it's just, it's not a genetic flaw in males that males take commitments more seriously than women. Like in America, most divorces, something like 70%, most divorces, it's the woman who files. And in a lot of cases, she's just vaguely dissatisfied and thinks she can do better. But I remember one of the first important books I ever read. I was about 14 years old. I read The Naked Ape by Desmond Morris. And Desmond Morris points out that men, for example, tend to have more lifelong friends than women do. It's like men form stronger bonds with other people, even though women are more sort of interpersonal interaction oriented than men are. Men tend to take it more seriously. And according to Desmond Morris, one of the reasons for this is that men would be forming, like men back in a hunter-gatherer society. Every able-bodied young man is a warrior for the tribe, with few exceptions. And so they're relying on each other to have each other's back in intertribal warfare and when they're out hunting mammoths and cave bears and this kind of stuff. So it's just, you need a stronger, cohesive group where everybody sticks up for everybody else. Whereas women, they're more likely to get traded off to another tribe for mating purposes. There's like a swap of nubile young women between these two tribes, or it may be there's intertribal warfare. The woman just gets snatched out of her tribe and taken to some other tribe where she's got to have a whole different set of friends, worshiping a whole different set of gods, maybe speaking a different language and all this. So women are just more adaptable, whereas men are more likely to form these like strong, lasting bonds between each other and apparently also with their mate. So I would guess that is like the main evolutionary genetic component of this, that women are just more likely to just be removed from one like tribal group and like transplanted into another one. So they have to like be more flexible with regard to this thing. And there wasn't as much need for them, except with regard to like their own children, that they have like these lifelong commitments where, it's like they wouldn't dream of breaking it. With men, apparently there is a statistically significant, higher level of this kind of commitment than in the female of the species. Just going with Desmond Morris. So I don't consider it to be a genetic flaw in males. And I don't consider it to be a kind of cultural sickness, because both of those are just black-pilled negativity. And I don't think it's really a modern trend either, because I think it probably goes back to the Stone Age that this kind of stuff evolved, if not before the Stone Age. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, I was telling someone that if I got cancer, I would not use conventional medicine to heal. First, I would rub hydrogen peroxide all over me and then hire monks to pray over me. Is that something that is possible? Can monks be hired to pray for healing? Well, you shouldn't hire monks, because monks aren't supposed to handle money. They're not supposed to do anything for pay, at least not Theravada Buddhist monks. I'm not exactly sure where the hydrogen peroxide comes in. I mean, according to the Bible, you're supposed to be anointed with oil before the elders lay their hands on you and pray over you to heal you of your sicknesses. So I'm not sure where hydrogen peroxide would necessarily be replacing some kind of ointment or oil for anointing. I guess that's why it's called ointment, right? Because you anoint it onto yourself. But there are like paritas, like chants that monks do for helping people to recover from illness. The main one in Theravada Buddhism is the Bojjhanga Sutta. So different paritas or protective chants have different purposes. There are a few all-purpose protective chants. I think the Ratana Sutta and I think it's the Mangala Sutta are just kind of like general blessings. But the Bojjhanga Sutta in particular is supposed to have special efficacy with regard to healing the sick, Although I have to admit that every sick animal I ever chanted the Bojjhanga Sutta over wound up dying. So it didn't really work so much in my case. And I think with regard to any kind of like healing powers resulting from like rituals or chanting, that kind of stuff, there's going to have to be the faith of the person and the faith of the monks or priests or whoever it is who are doing the chanting. And if you've got one person with just like absolute unquestioning faith, that can kind of drown out some of the doubts of other people involved. But still, there has to be some kind of strong belief or confidence that it's going to work on the part of somebody involved in order for it to work. Because it's not just that the magic blah, blah, blah of the chant has any kind of power to heal anybody or to exorcise malevolent spirits from a house or anything like that. You know, it's the beliefs, the perceptions of the people involved that have the power. So it's like a placebo effect. So it may be, I mean, you might want to try like a Christian Science practitioner. I assume they still have those. Or seek out like a monk or a priest who specializes in this and actually has a track record. I mean, you don't want to just go to the local Cambodian temple or Thai temple and ask the monks there to pray over you unless you just have unquestioning faith or confidence that it's going to work. Because a lot of these Asian monks, you know, they're kind of missionaries in the West, but more likely they're just sort of like the masters of ceremonies at a cultural center for the immigrants of their own nationality who live there. And, you know, they really are not some kind of master with healing powers. So, I mean, if you are going to have somebody chant over you to heal you of some, you know, some ailment, then you should try to find someone who specializes in it and not just, you know, just go knocking on the door of the local Cambodian temple and asking them to do it. Because they're not going to have the confidence or the faith probably to really do it in a way that works. So, but I mean, if you, the standard Theravada Buddhist, like Pali Parita or protective chant that is used for healing the sick would be the Bojjhanga Sutta. So you might want to just try chanting it yourself. It's out there. You can find it, I'm sure. And so I'm just going to move on to Jeffrey's next question. He says, also, I have heard that sexual energy is healing energy. Are they related? Well, sexual energy and healing energy both would require a certain vitality, you know, like a brightness of spirit, I guess. You know, the more vitality you've got, the more sexual energy you've got, the more healing energy you've got. So, I mean, to that extent, I would say, yeah, sexual energy can be healing energy to a certain degree. But, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, there is no special energy that's just sexual energy. You know, you've just got like energy that, you know, some of it is siphoned off for sexual purposes or, you know, sexual directions. And then your body naturally heals using some more of this kind of just sort of natural vitality. But so there is a connection, I think, between sexual energy and healing energy. Both of them require just, you know, the vital essence of life. I mean, you're less likely to be sexually energetic if you're not well, and you're less likely to be well if you just low sexual energy, I guess. So yeah, there is a kind of relation, but it's really not a kind of Buddhist concept. Maybe in yoga or something like that, they would have more of some kind of system worked out on how it all works. But I think it's just using my own understanding of biology and so forth, it would just be the same kind of vitality that could be used for either or for entirely something else. So, yeah, I mean, Freud might have something to say about that, but I'm really not an expert on Freud. He turned everything into sex. Freud was just sort of a master of second chakra. Oh. So yeah, I guess I got about as far with that as I'm liable to get. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Quasator. And Quasator says, I've heard you tell the story about the monk who self-deleted because he couldn't always get into jhana and then became an arahant. I find it difficult to understand since the story would indicate that he has attachment to jhana and that the craving for it is the barrier to achieving it. Is there more background to the story? Could it be that the craving wasn't specifically for the jhanic bliss or equanimity itself, but for what the jhanas lead to, and once he put that craving aside, there was no craving left? Or maybe he realized that jhana is not nibbana, and not having jhana brought suffering, so he dropped craving for jhana, and that was the last attachment he needed to let go of. Well, he's referring to the Godhika Sutta, and I did warn you in advance that I was going to come back to Godhika. And he was the monk who got jhana and lost it and got it and lost it and got it and lost it. Until finally, after like 7 times that this happened, he was thinking, this is like the context that Quasator was asking for. He was thinking, if I die with jhana, I'm guaranteed at least a Brahma realm. I mean, that is the belief in Theravada Buddhism, that the Brahma realms correspond to jhanic realms. And you've mastered, first jhana, you can get into like the lower Brahma realms. You master second jhana, you get into higher Brahma realms, etc. And you have to get into like the formless jhanas in order to get into like the highest heaven realms. And so, anyways, Godhika was thinking, if he dies with this mastery of jhana while he has it temporarily, he's guaranteed of like a really advanced heaven realm. But if he dies without jhana, there's no guarantees at all. He could be reborn as an animal or in hell or anything. So it was just sort of like this kind of, I don't know, what it was like Pascal, I think, had this deal, where to believe in God and be wrong is better than not to believe in God and be wrong. So, it's just kind of like this game theory or something where it's like, if I die with jhana, guaranteed of like a very high heaven realm, if I die without it, no guarantee at all. So he just made the decision that the next time he was really in the groove with his meditation and had jhana, that he was just going to end it before he fell back out of it again. That's the explanation in the text, in the sutta itself, in the Godhika Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya. So that's the way it is described in the sutta itself. That it was just kind of this idea that, if he died while he had jhana, he was guaranteed of at least a Brahma realm. So he went for it because he knew that just based on his past experience, it was likely he was just going to wind up losing it again. And then all bets are off with regard to how he's going to be reborn. And then just through just the momentum of practice that he had going and the paramis that he had cultivated, just the virtue and just the momentum of his holy life, it was sufficient through whatever way. It's not fully described exactly how it happened in the sutta, that he became enlightened. Instead of going to a Brahma realm, he just attained parinibbana at the moment of death. So did I answer the question? Is there more background to the story? Yeah, it was just this idea. If he dies with jhana, he's guaranteed of a high heaven realm. And if he dies without it, there's no guarantee at all. So he just made the decision that next time he had jhana real good, he was just going to end it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the proto-pseudo-monk, formerly known as Cool Whip. And the proto-pseudo-monk, he has sort of a preliminary question that turns out not to be one of his allotted 3 questions. So the first question we can kind of skip over, and then we will address that in the subsequent questions. He says, have you heard about or seen the ex-monk Varapanyo in this video? And then he has some video link with regard to this person who used to go by the name of Varapanyo. I don't remember what his name is now. See, technically, might not even be ex-monk, as he was never a monk in the first place. He claims to have been a Buddhist monk for 7 years, and since disrobing does daily live streams with some dude that legally changed his name to Shiva at Shiva Kailash Shambho, where all these spiritual bagpackers seem to do is ask for donations. His channel appears on my very dharmic feed no matter what, and I usually ignore it. The algorithm loves his trolling rage bait, but clicked on his latest stream as it really caught my attention and couldn't believe it when he heard this. Please listen to his confession here. And this is where the ex-Varapano admitted that he was never a real monk to begin with, and he was just pretending to be a monk in order to get donations. And then he was investing that in Bitcoin or something. And once he got enough that he could just be independently wealthy, then he just dropped out. And he looked like he was kind of drunk in the video. Somebody in the comments saying now he's just sleep deprived. But I mean, he was just kind of like slouched over on his side with kind of like this sleepy smile on his face while he's singing like a canary and admitting to being a total fraud. See, on fake monks using, okay, so then there's like the what's the word? The rubric, the heading of three questions here, the three following questions on fake monks using dana or generosity to invest in Bitcoin for financial independence. So, the first question from proto-pseudo-monk, formerly known as Cool Whip. What do you think of this man's plan for being a monk, and are you shocked? From the beginning, asking for donations to invest in Bitcoin and exiting when he had enough profits to retire, he couldn't even believe he was enrobed for 7 years. People giving him money as a donation thinking he was a monk. Well, I remember coming across this person, and before I get into the question, get into the answer of the question, I mean, you can block this person from your YouTube feed. You know, there's some channel that keeps coming up and you want to avoid it. You just kind of click on something around it and say you're not interested and don't show anything from this channel ever again or else. And the algorithm will cooperate with that, I'm pretty sure. At least on YouTube. But let's get back to this question. I came across him, I saw him in some videos, and my woman especially, she called him the sleepy weepy monk because he'd always talk in like this sleepy monotone and never looked like he was fully awake, which could have just been part of the act to look like a serene meditative monk. And she took more interest in him than I did. And she was scandalized because, I mean, she could see practically from the very beginning that he was some kind of fraud, probably just doing it for donations. And first of all, I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. So, I mean, it was kind of obvious to me too, there was a possibility that he was a scammer. But I'm less likely to jump to conclusions than my woman. And also, I have come across so many monks that are like this, like in Burma, some of the most famous monks in Burma, I won't name any names because they kind of have, at least one of them is very well respected among like certain Buddhist communities in the United States. And he's got at least one monastery in the United States that's, kind of a branch monastery that, he is like a wealthy businessman who wears monk's robes in order to make more money. He just charges exorbitant fees, even in fourth world Burma, for his Dharma talks. And I just did not approve of him at all. Somebody would donate some calendar from his monastery. I'd just take it down. It's like, no, we're not advertising this monk because he's just a rich businessman wearing monk's robes. And I've come across monks like this that, they're just trying to get rich and famous. And wearing monk's robes helps them to be that way. So in Burma, it's common, much more common than in the West, I think, at least with regard to Theravada Buddhist monks. Most monks handle money anyway. Most monks are receiving donations and just going out and buying, whatever they want. So I was exposed to more. So I was less scandalized by the whole thing than my woman, who, she's relatively naive and hadn't come across a lot of that before, whereas there's lots of it. I remember there was one monk who came to stay at my monastery back when I was the abbot of Wonbo Wildlife Refuge Monastery in northwestern Burma. This young monk, like a village monk, came and he wanted to stay at my place. And most monks in that entire area, the overwhelming majority of them, just did not follow the rules of monastic discipline. So I just pretty much flat out told him I really don't think it's likely to work, because if you're from around here, chances are you don't follow the rules like is required at this monastery. And then it was like he just kind of unburdened his heart to me, this young monk, saying, I know it's like this and it bothers me too, and I just want to be a good monk, and that's why I came here, because I want to follow the rules and be a good monk just like in the text as well as I can. It was like he really did appear to be emotionally moved when he's giving me this speech. And so again, I am willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. So I said, all right, you can stay. We'll see how it goes. And then he stayed for maybe a month or two. I don't remember exactly how long he stayed. It wasn't for very long. And then one day he just suddenly took off, and there was some stuff missing. Like there was like a human anatomy chart in the congregation hall, showing the bones and everything, just help monks to look upon what the human body is really made of. That was gone. He just took some stuff and just disappeared. And then after he left, I was told that he was scamming the villagers for money, saying that he was like collecting funds because his father needed an eye operation or something, or it was some Seattle needed an eye operation. I can't remember the details. I remember there was somebody needing an eye operation involved. And then after he figured he had enough money, he just took off. So, it's just a relatively common occurrence in places like Burma, where you've got monks, including one of the most famous monks in the whole country, they're in it for the money. So this Varapanyo, I would assume that he really was ordained when he's like admitting that he was never really a monk. He probably means that even though he was officially technically ordained as a monk, he just never really believed in it and was never really trying to be a monk. It's like you can get ordained fairly easily. It doesn't take any Herculean effort to get some Asian monks to ordain you. You don't even have to be a Buddhist for some of them to ordain you. So he probably really was ordained. It's just that he just adopted this persona of always speaking in a like a low, quiet monotone. Maybe that's just the way he was anyway. Never opening his eyes all the way, just so that he seemed like he was like a blissed out meditator. And I remember he dropped out of the monkhood for a while, and then he just appeared on videos again. My woman was showing me this stuff. She was keeping up with it. I really didn't have much interest in him. But for a while, he was like a monastery attendant in Thailand or something. And maybe he became a monk again or something. And yeah, I really don't know exactly what to make of it. He could just be trolling and just exaggerating what a fraudulent shit he was, just for the hell of it. But to some degree, he apparently really was a fraudulent shit. Just preying upon the gullibility and faith of simple-hearted people. So let's see here. I guess I answered that kind of question. What do you think of this man's plan for being a monk, and are you shocked? No, I wasn't shocked, because I've been exposed to plenty of that when I was a monk in Burma, and just 98% of the Sangha in Burma handles money. Most of them aren't scamming, they're just like, there was an old monk that used to live with me, the one that was bitten by a cobra and eventually died. He handled money too. And what he was doing was he would actually make brooms out of like palm fronds and a bamboo pole. And he made good brooms. We were using the brooms he made around the monastery. They're relatively good brooms. But he was having his niece, who lived in a nearby village, sell some of them in the market. And then he was using, the relatively small amount of money he was getting from that to buy like beetle quids and maybe cigars. And I don't know how he chewed beetle. He had like 4 teeth left in his head, but still he was able to chew beetle for some reason. And I'm not talking about the bugs, the insects, coleopteran insects. There's a drug, a mild drug called betel, B-E-T-E-L, the areca nut that is chewed in South Asia and Southeast Asia. It's relatively disgusting. It turns your slobber into something like ketchup, just red and thick. Relatively gross. But he was handling money. I mean, he wasn't like deliberately scamming people he was just making brooms and having his niece sell them in the village so that he could afford his betel nut and who knows what else, tea or whatever. I used to think that monk would have been more venerable if he hadn't been a monk, because he did live just a very simple, austere, humble kind of existence. He just didn't follow the rules very well. And just handling money wasn't the only rule he broke. I think he cooked dinner for himself sometimes. I really didn't want to know. I'm just like, I wasn't looking for trouble. And then sometimes he'd go for alms round with like wearing a sweatshirt and just like a blanket wrapped around him instead of his robes. But he was like 80 years old and just very simple man. I really didn't want to fight with him. So, yeah, I guess I answered that. I was not shocked. So, I'm going to move on to the proto-pseudo-monk's second question, which I might have already answered here. Is this shocking behavior common in the Buddhist world, generally and specifically Theravada? And why are people giving so much money to monks, to renunciants? That makes no sense. Well, the first part of this is the shocking behavior common in the Buddhist world. As I've already said, it's really fairly common. In fact, one of the most famous monks in all of Burma is like this. So that part, it's relatively common. Certainly not unheard of. But with regard to this question, why are people giving so much money to monks, to renunciants? It makes no sense. Well, most people in Burma probably don't even know that it's against the rules for monks to handle money. I remember that the Burmese equivalent of the Thai Sangha Raja, I met him once. He came to the monastery where I was staying at. It's in Burmese, it's the Sangha Mahanayaka Sayadaw, the great leader of the Sangha. And he gave this little talk to the people who came to listen to his talk. And he was talking about, the great merit you get by donating to the Sangha, donating to monks. He handled money himself. He was the supreme leader of the Burmese Theravada Buddhist Sangha. And he's just willingly accepting donations of money and telling people the merit that they will get by donating money to monks. And so, if even this monk, the highest ranking monk in the entire country, is saying it's not only okay to offer money to monks, but it's good and you ought to do it, then what are the devout, gullible, faith-oriented Buddhists gonna believe? A lot of Burmese lay people don't even know it's against the rules for a monk to touch women, because so many monks be like rubbing up against girls on the buses and stuff. So I'm not shocked at all. I was pretty naive, and a lot of Western Buddhists are really naive to the amount of just decadence and degeneracy that prevails in the Sangha. And it's too bad, really. It's like I've said before, it's like 2% of Burmese monks will go so far as not to handle money. Whereas among Western monks, it's like 50%. Because in the West, first of all, you're not just blindly following along sheep-like with what everyone else is doing. You're having to break away from your own culture, maybe your own family and friends, in order to do this that you feel very strongly about, and you're doing it for idealistic reasons. You want to become enlightened. But in Burma or other traditional Buddhist countries, a lot of people just become monks because, they're like the seventh child of a poor subsistence farmer. Maybe they just get sent to the monastery by their parents because there's just too many mouths to feed, and they want the prestige of having a monk in the family. And he might have no spiritual calling whatsoever. Some of them are just lazy. They want to live an easy life. Some of them want to get like a free education at the monastic universities. They want upward social mobility. Some of them want money. You're not going to make much money as a subsistence farmer or a toddy tree climber. You make more money as a monk. So, it's just really common in Asia, and it's too bad. I really am sorry about it. It's sort of like, I've said before, the position of Theravada Buddhism in Burma is similar to the position of Roman Catholicism in Western Europe, like in the 14th century, where the people have unquestioning faith in their religion. Their religion is true. All of it's true. Every word in the text is true. And you do have some very saintly monks and nuns, very advanced saintly ones, but they are, of course, a small minority. And for the most part, the clergy is just corrupt as hell, which doesn't mean that they're bad people. Most monks are actually good people. They're like morally and just with regard to just inherent virtue at a somewhat higher level than the average layperson. Something got them to become a monk, but it's like the whole tradition, it has become so corrupt. With, like I said, even the Sangha Raja of Burma, the Sangha Mahanayaka Sayadaw of Burma, is handling money and encouraging lay people to donate money to monks, telling them how much merit they're going to make. And there are a lot of wise guy Sayados out there doing the same thing at their sermons. They'll be encouraging people to donate money to monks. I remember one time I had been staying at Atthakavagga National Park, and I was leaving. The monsoon season had started, so I was clearing out. I usually just spent the hot seasons there. And we stopped at this monastery where, everyone wanted to meet the strange Western monk who was famously living in a cave out in the woods. So, I'm led into like the congregation hall at this village monastery, and the Sayadaw has a plate put right in front of me on the stage. And then he's telling everybody to donate to the Western monk so he can pay for his boat fare and everything. And I'm just like, no, this is not cool. And the monk that was with me, who knew me, he went to the Sayadaw and said, he does not like this at all. And so the monk, the Sayadaw, the abbot of the monastery there, comes up to me and says, just be patient. We're just getting you some money for your boat fare. And then I just got up and walked. It's like, fuck this. And I just refused to go to his monastery ever again after that. That was more than enough for me. But that's often the way it goes. I remember another time when I left that area at Atthakavagga National Park. I made this raft. I was going to try and be clever and just ride a raft that I made down to the Chindwin River and then down to the town of Monua. But it just wasn't working because this raft did not have good hydrodynamics like a canoe. As soon as you stopped paddling, it would just stop. There was no streamlining at all. And also, you had to be out in the middle of the river where the current was going, like near the banks of the river where the water is relatively shallow and safe. Then sometimes the current's actually going backwards. It took a while for me to realize that. So I wind up stopping at this monastery by the side of the river. And I asked where the monastery was. I was going to just ask for permission to spend the night at their monastery. And I get to the congregation hall, and there's this shady looking monk, his teeth all red from chewing betel, sitting there on a stool with a handful of money. And the villagers who wanted to go into the monastery congregation hall to watch TV on the monastery's TV set had to pay to get in. And you had this monk chewing betel with a handful of money, just collecting the money. I mean, it wasn't even really donations. It's like, you want to watch our TV, you got to pay. And that kind of shit is just all over the country. In Hmong state in the south, there's a little stricter monastic discipline. Certain areas like Shan state and like the area of Mandalay is just notoriously bad. School monasteries are like snake pits. I stayed at a school monastery for over a year in Mahagandha, which had a reputation for being one of the stricter ones. And it was maybe 10% of the Sangha didn't handle money there. But still, you got these signs up outside the outhouse, where, Vinaya book for sale, book on monastic discipline for sale, this kind of stuff. So, yeah, this Varapanyo, he's just a Western version of a kind of fake monk that is not a rare species in Asian Buddhism. And like I say, in answer to the question, the lay people, a lot of lay people don't even know what's against the rules. I mean, when you've got the leader of the Sangha in the entire country telling you that you're going to get all this merit for donating money to monks, I mean, what are they supposed to believe? So, after that harangue, which has probably just destroyed the faith of everybody watching this video, I'm going to go back to Proto-Pseudo-Monk's third question. What are the karmic results for such behavior? Straight to hell? Well, I would guess that you're probably not going to go straight to hell unless it's really an egregious case of ripping people off as a monk. I mean, if we can go by the texts themselves, then there's a number of suttas or also scenes in the books of monastic discipline where Mahamoggallana, I think, would be walking along with some other monk and he'd start smiling. And then the other monk would ask him, why are you smiling? And he says, wait till we get back to the monastery and I'll tell you. So then they get back to the monastery. The monk asks the venerable one, why were you smiling? And he would give this account of some ghost that he had seen, like hungry ghosts, where, you've got some ghost that's on fire, just flying through the air screaming, or you've got some ghost that has elephantiasis of the scrotum, and you've got like hawks and crows all pecking at his balls, where he's, obviously in great distress, this kind of thing. And it was always a case of somebody in a position of high trust and authority, like abusing that trust. So like a corrupt judge that would take bribes, or monks and nuns who just were not keeping their vows at all and were just taking advantage of the faith and like credulity of the lay people. So going with Orthodox Theravada, just a shameless, corrupt monk who's ripping people off under the guise of being a holy man. I mean, there's a good chance they'd wind up in the Peta realm being tormented with crows pecking at their balls or some such. Possibly go to hell, if it's bad enough. But to some degree, this is sort of a glorification of Dhamma, which is understandable in a Dhamma text. But I think a lot of these monks who are handling money, I don't think every monk who handles money or every monk who's even asking for money is necessarily going to wind up in some gruesome lower realm. That they're definitely going to be getting some kind of bad karma for, especially the ones that are just knowingly deceiving people, like this Varapanyo admitted to doing. That it's going to come back on them somehow. You don't know exactly how karma is going to come back to somebody, how what goes around comes around. I mean, at the very least, it's going to be something similar to what he perpetrated on others. He's going to have some kind of deep religious faith, and he's going to wind up just getting like taken advantage of and exploited by some fake holy man himself. Or he's just going to just have like deep faith in a charlatan who's just going to lead him astray, maybe lifetime after lifetime, because he's done it to so many other people. It is true. And what few videos of his that I have seen, generally over my woman's shoulder as she watches, because, I mean, she didn't believe in him from the very beginning. He knows, the words to say. What he was saying wasn't like just flat out heresy or anything. It reminds me of, there's a certain documentary, Kumari? No, I can't remember now. But he was this Indian guy living in America. I think he was born in New Jersey or something. And he decided to impersonate a holy man just to see what kind of results he would get. And he wound up having like a cult following. And then finally, and it was like, sometimes it would be really rough stuff. People would come up to him, talking about how they were like incestuously abused as a child, this kind of stuff. And he's on the spot. He has to try and help them. And he's deliberately, he's not deliberately trying to fuck them over or anything. He's just seeing how well he can, just sort of throw himself into the role of a holy man. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the documentary. It's worth watching. Yeah, I keep wanting to say Kumara or something like that. But at the end, he's going to like come clean and admit to his followers that he's just like this producer of documentaries born in New Jersey. And he's like in the bathroom, just like holding his head. He is in this state of just panic and fear at the result. And the only person who really behaved negatively was this yoga instructor who had started teaching his methods, visualizing the blue light and all the stuff that he was just making up. She was like ashamed of herself and pissed off because she actually bought into it and was like teaching his techniques. But most of the other people, being kind of lukewarm Westerners anyway, they just forgave him and, shook his hand or whatever. So the karmic results for monks that just exploit the faith of their followers in order to get rich or whatever. Yeah, it's probably subtle. It's not like they're necessarily, killing anybody, but it's really hard to say, and it would depend on the individual. Like from the Buddhist point of view, the one thing that is worse than murder for a monk, of the four parajikas, they're like in ascending order of severity. You start with just having sex, which is for a monk bad enough. And then after that is stealing. Then after that is murder. Then what's even worse than that is deliberately lying to lay people about having attained superhuman mental states. So I don't know if this Varapanyo guy, I don't remember what his real name is. I don't know if he was actually going that far. I don't think he was like claiming to be enlightened or any such thing. So there's at least that. That from the Theravada Buddhist point of view could land you in hell. Because it's even worse than murder for a monk to do. But just, having the hand out for donations, and in his case, he was having the hand out a lot because he was trying to become independently wealthy through doing this stuff. There's going to be some kind of negative results. Possibly, like I already said, it may be that he's just going to get taken advantage of and exploited and disillusioned and just kind of have his faith fucked over by somebody else. Maybe repeatedly. But it's really hard to say. For different people, it's subjective. Karma is a subjective thing depending on your own volitions and so forth. So it's really hard for an external observer to really say what's going to happen. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskazes. He's in a kind of humorous vein. He says, if Earth is the third planet from the sun, does that mean all countries are third world countries? No. Cherzaskazes is a second question. I managed to get through the first week following the fifth precept. Okay. What do you say? Well, Cherzaskazes, he admits to being an alcoholic. And recently, he has gone cold turkey and has gone a week without drinking anything. He went through the withdrawal symptoms and everything. And so, I mean, all I can say is sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Good work. Congratulations. And stick with it. Don't just start getting complacent and fall off the wagon. And with regard to this, I assume it's gettable, but the letters of Venerable Jnanavira, who wrote Clearing the Path, I think, is his famous book. He's this notorious, eccentric, intellectual, existentialist British monk who lived in Ceylon from like 1950 to 1965 and considered himself to have become a Sotapanna. He went to Ceylon, also known as Sri Lanka, with the first famous Jnanamoli, Osbert Moore. And he eventually self-deleted in 1965. But he has quite the following now. He has much more of a following now than he did when he was alive, especially among like intellectual Western monks and some Sri Lankan monks, like intellectual ones, because he's very intellectual. He was really into existentialism before he became a monk, and he was converted to Buddhism by reading Julius Evola. Julius Evola's famous book on Buddhism. When he was like in a hospital in Italy during World War II, I think he was in the military, like the British military in World War II. So in his letters that are often like connected to his Clearing the Path, and which I consider to be much more interesting, it's just letters where he's talking about, the monk's life and existentialism, this kind of stuff. F.H. Bradley, his favorite philosophers, he's mentioning those in his letters sometimes, that he talks about like the psychology of addiction. And I read it a long time ago, and I'm not going to try and repeat it because I'm not at all confident that I get it right. But what he said about addiction and what it takes to really overcome addiction is on point. And if Terzaskas can find the letters of Venerable Jnanavira and find, what he was saying about addiction, it could be available from Path Press, which I recently found out also has free copies of my Atthakavagga translation. I think they're free. So if you look up Path Press, Path Press was originally founded by followers of this same Jnanavira. So probably they would have his Clearing the Path and his letters available, in addition to my translation of the Atthakavagga, which is big. It's a goodly sized book, but on the better side, it's got the English and Pali just completely opposite each other, unlike my new translation, where they're not facing, the corresponding verses, Pali and English, are not necessarily facing on opposite sides of the book. So, yeah, maybe you could find the writings of Venerable Jnanavira from Path Press, which should be easily findable online. And what he does say about addiction, it's like you have to be like 100% to overcome addiction. It's like part of your mind likes the addiction. So that's the hard part, because when that part of your mind that likes the addiction is allowed to take over, then of course you fall off the wagon. So there has to be like I'm not even going to try and repeat what Jnanavira said about it, but what he said was insightful and intelligent and largely correct, I think. So that's something you could look up if you're into that. But congratulations on like not drinking. My father was a hardcore alcoholic. He was like an Eastern European type alcoholic. He drank about a fifth of vodka a day. And when he cold turkeyed, he was like having serious delirium tremens. He was hallucinating and all kinds of stuff. It was difficult. So good luck with that. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cyrus Frame. Let's see. Okay. This is from Cyrus Frame, as I just said. And Cyrus Frame says, I really liked your idea of there being only one skanda, or in Pali kanda, perception and volition, or perception/volition, both being just one aggregate. It seems to me that it is a byproduct of natural selection. For example, you hear a tiger roar and you run or freeze. The perception of the sound and the urge to move are a single unified biological event. It is language that makes a distinction, but that is a map of the process not the thing itself. The map can be useful, but it is important not to mistake the map for the territory. Is this what you have in mind when you say there is only one skanda? Okay, I got to look back at the bookcase to see if I have the book still. Okay. Apparently, oh, here it is. I still have the book. Okay. So, the very first philosophical essay on Buddhism I ever wrote was on mainly trying to explain the 5 khandhas, especially the 4 mental ones. And it was caused by reading this book. I found this book at a used bookstore in Mandalay long ago. Buddhist Logic Volume 2. I never had Volume 1. I think I eventually found it and read it. And it's by Fyodor Cherbatsky, who was a Russian, like a Buddhistic scholar back before the Soviet Union, like well over 100 years ago. And there's one statement in here. I'm not going to try and find it. Well, actually, I am kind of, but I'm not going to find it. But there's this one statement he makes in here about how there's like an artificial distinction between like the spatial aspect and the temporal aspect of the same thing. And that caused me to really start thinking, especially with regard to like perception and volition. I mean, really the thought experiment that really got me going on this whole idea that Cyrus Frame is referring to was just the idea of what is it that comes first? Is it perception or volition? Because, I mean, how are you going to direct your attention to something? I mean, you can't direct your attention to something before you perceive its existence. But then how do you become aware of it, direct your, attention of it without, it's like, how can one come before the other? Either you have to have the volition to direct your attention at something without having perceived it yet, or you have to perceive it without having directed your attention to it. So it seems like the perception and the volition involved would have to be simultaneous, which ultimately Buddhism does teach. And it's like, if they have to arise together, they can't possibly be separated. They always necessarily arise in the same place at the same time and can't be separate. They can't exist independently of each other, which Theravada Buddhism teaches. Then really it's just 2 different ways of looking at the same thing. That's what occurred to me. So that was just sort of like a kind of Copernican revolution in my mind with regard to understanding Buddhist philosophy, I think. It's just like there's just one mental khandha because, you've got these 2 other mental khandhas that are Vedana or feeling plus consciousness. So perception and volition, it seems to me that they're the same. It's just the temporal aspect and the spatial aspect, or the static and the kinetic, the noun and the verb, noun and predicate, that are just artificially separated when really it's just 2 aspects of the same thing, like light and shining or wind and blowing. You can't have one without the other. You can't have light without shining. You cannot have shining without light. It's just a noun and a verb that are referring to exactly the same thing. And so I came up with this idea back around 1996 or so that it's like perception is like the static or noun aspect, and volition is just sort of like the active kinetic aspect of the same thing, the very same phenomenon. And then I went further with feeling. This wasn't in my first essay. This was sort of a later development. But feeling really is just another kind of perception. At first, in this essay that I wrote, feeling was just bare sensation, unprocessed sensory data. But I think it's in this book also, in a different section. It's talking about the Dignaga school of Buddhism, which was like a medieval Mahayana logical school of Buddhism in India. And there was Venerable Dharmodara is one of the leading philosophers in that group. And he pointed out that bare sensation without any kind of like perceptual interpretation at all I mean, it's the same as it not even being there. To exist is to be perceived. So the whole thing of Vedana being just bare, unprocessed sensory data, it just kind of falls through because it's like a non-existent thing until it gets perceived, and then all you're really aware of is the perception. And consciousness is just kind of the substance of the perception and the volition. The perception and volition are like the form that the consciousness takes. So ultimately, it's all just one. If you include feeling, like pleasure and pain, as just perceptions, which is what I'm inclined to do now, there's no need to separate feeling from perception if it's just like feeling is just sort of like a less intellectual kind of perception. It's just kind of a sensory perception. But it's all perception. It's just sort of like an arbitrary distinction. You got verbal perception and nonverbal perception, that kind of thing. Or like, pictorial would be kind of along with verbal. But I don't even see that there's necessarily a qualitative difference. It's all just symbols that are a kind of interpretation of what supposedly is happening. But that's all you're really exposed to. Gosh, I don't know if I'm just mystifying everybody and boring everybody by talking about this kind of stuff. So let's see. Perception of the sound and the urge to move are a single unified biological event. Well, not necessarily. I mean, the perception of the sound and the urge to move are not necessarily the same, unless maybe it's just like this reflex where you just jump when you hear a loud noise. But you hear like a rustling in the bushes. That's not going to be the exact same as the urge to move. Because sometimes you just stop and, just freeze, and then try and understand what it is. But we don't need to get into that. So let's see, the map can be useful, it's important. So where's the actual question? Oh, is this what you have in mind when you say there is only one khandha? Yeah, I mean, I already explained what I had in mind. Is that, it's all... Our world is will and perception. It's like Schopenhauer, the world as will and representation. Will is Chaitanya, representation is Sanya. So it's samsara as Chaitanya and Sanya. That's how you would translate Schopenhauer into more Buddhistic language. And the Vedana, the feeling, is just another kind of perception. It's just sort of a non-verbal kind of perception. And consciousness itself is just sort of like the formless essence of it all. So that's how I get down to one khandha. I mean, the rupa khandha, you can't prove that even exists at all. The only way you know of physical matter is through perception. So that's perception too. So that's how I did it. The first step was from reading Cherbatsky's Buddhist Logic that I got in Burma from a used bookstore, which kind of got me thinking about how, perception and volition have to be simultaneous. And really, it's just two ways of looking at the same phenomenon. One more as a noun and the other more as a verb. One static and one kinetic. So let's see here. That's essentially what I had in mind. Although it's hard to explain stuff like this clearly, which is probably why most of you have already moved on to cat videos or something. Anyways, Cyrus Frame's second question is a follow-up on the first one. He says, also, in coming up with this idea, were you influenced by F.H. Bradley? And no, I came up with this idea before I ever heard of F.H. Bradley. That I came up with this from Cherbatsky, Volume 2. The F.H. Bradley, I first heard about F.H. Bradley from reading the letters of Jnanavira that I was discussing just a few minutes before. That he was reading F.H. Bradley's Principles of Logic. And so it sounded good because F.H. Bradley was a kind of idealist. And he followed the coherence theory of truth, which is a statement is true if and only if it is compatible with all the other beliefs of what you consider to be true. So, yeah, it is not influenced by F.H. Bradley. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cole. And Cole says, I've been watching your Archaic Buddhism series, and something has really struck me that I would love to hear you elaborate on. The Atthakavagga Sutta, or the Atthakavagga, has a very Zen quality to it, especially in regards to the emphasis on abandoning the conceptual thinking mode of the mind. Furthermore, the Chan or Zen approach to meditation seems similar. The jhanas. I've even heard Ajahn Sona mention that Chan, also Zen, is actually the Chinese word or Japanese word for jhana. Do you have any thoughts about the parallel here between the various form and formless jhanas described and the Chan Zen teachings of meditative states regarding direct experience of the non-conceptual mind? Well, it is true that Chan and Zen are both derived from the Sanskrit word jhana, which isn't so much referring to the 4 jhanas or the 8 jhanas of Theravada Buddhism, but it just means meditation. So Zen is the meditation school of Mahayana Buddhism. That's what it means essentially. Jhana literally means meditation, and even in Pali, it probably, like the 4 jhanas, were just the 4 levels of meditation. Not like superhuman states. First jhana would just be elementary meditation done correctly, in my opinion. So, let's see, what is the actual question here? See, do you have any thoughts about the parallel here between the various form and formless jhanas described in the Chan or Zen teachings of meditation states regarding direct experience of the non-conceptual mind? Well, I mean, formless jhanas I consider to be an anachronism. I think the formless jhanas were added later, which is why they're just kind of tacked on to 4th jhana. They're seen as kind of annexes to 4th jhana. Originally, it was 4 jhanas. Abhidhamma made a 5th jhana, which didn't really strike traction. And then the formless realms, I'm pretty sure that was added later as the systematizers of Indian philosophy just kept running with the ball and adding more and more stuff, making stuff more and more complicated and hopefully comprehensive, but they didn't really succeed at that, in my opinion. But the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, it has been called like proto-Majjhimaka, that like Prajnaparamita and Majjhimaka really were a kind of reform movement, getting back to the earliest teachings, or attempting to get back to the earliest teachings, and get away from this scholastic, hyper-complicated gobbledygook like the Abhidhamma philosophies. So yeah, it's like the Buddha probably was originally teaching that you're not going to become enlightened by having views. You're not going to become enlightened by figuring anything out, by thinking about anything, because all of that is just perception. That if you want to know ultimate reality, you have to stop perceiving, stop trying to understand it through perception, and just get straight to it. In the seen, only the seen, in the heard, only the heard, etc. And not cling even to that. So yeah, Zen Buddhism in certain ways may come closer to the original spirit of Archaic Buddhism than later developments of Theravada, for example, Abhidhamma and the commentarial tradition and a lot of the devotional stuff. Although Zen itself is very corrupt with a lot of Pure Land stuff, a lot of mythology and so forth thrown into that also. I was somewhat disillusioned when I first went to a Zen monastery, because when you read books about Zen, it's all these men dressed in black standing around speaking in riddles and hitting each other with sticks. And then you go to an actual Zen monastery in, say, California, and nobody hits anybody with sticks and nobody talks in riddles, really. You know, it's just rather mundane, which didn't really attract me much at all. I mean, at least there should be one person hitting people with sticks. But no. I mean, every story I've ever read about the Zen master Rinzai, the founder of the Rinzai school of Zen in Japan, every single story I've ever read about him, he's hitting somebody with a stick or just punching them. But I'm digressing wildly at this point. So, do I have any thoughts about the parallel between the various form and formless jhanas? Well, not so much that. Described in the Chan Zen teachings of meditative states regarding direct experience of the non-conceptual mind. Well, it'd be better to compare Zen teachings with like the Atthakavagga. Just leave aside any kind of schematic list of different levels. I mean, that's already samsara. If you got levels, different levels, it's samsaric. So, I mean, you want to get past all the like division and systematization, classification, and just get straight to unadulterated reality. And the Atthakavagga really was oriented towards that. And Zen Buddhism also is, in its own way, it's a more Chinese kind of take, more intuitive, less like systematically mystical, and more of a kind of intuitive wisdom approach to essentially the same thing. So, I really don't think that various form and formless jhanas really would be the issue here. Seems to me. And I'm just going to move on to Cole's next question, which is a follow-up. He says, a follow-up question would be regarding the intermingling of Buddhism and Taoism after Bodhidharma introduced Buddhism into China. I have seen in many writings how the Chan patriarchs seem to view samsara and nirvana as two aspects of the great void, which seems counter to what the Buddha taught. Descriptions of Nibbana by the Buddha seem to imply that there isn't a reality beyond that. Nibbana and samsara emerging from the void as a concept seems exactly the same as the Taoist yin-yang differentiation from Wuji emptiness concept. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, I do not think that the original teachings of the Buddha were implying that there was anything beyond Nibbana. That, in my opinion, Nibbana is reality. You can quote me on that. Nibbana or Nirvana is reality. And samsara is like a delusional take, kind of fevered dream. It's perception, essentially. Especially if you believe the perception and are not detached from it, that you're identifying with the perceptions. So let's see here. These long questions kind of are a little bit difficult to handle sometimes because I got to like search for the question mark. And the question here is, any thoughts on that? So, yeah, I mean, Indian philosophy especially, they're always trying to up one. It's like one-upmanship. You know, like in the Upanishads or other kinds of just Indian philosophy in general. You've got some school saying this is the highest truth, this is ultimate reality. And then you've got some other school of philosophy saying, nope, you guys are just limited because we found, we know of a reality that's even higher than that. So, I mean, a standard example, a really obvious example, is Brahma in Buddhism. In like Vedanta, Brahma is the personification of ultimate reality. Brahman is essentially what Nirvana is to the Buddhists. Brahman is ultimate reality. Then the Buddhists come along and say, nope, that's Brahma he's like a mediocre level deity. There's all these levels above Brahma, and some of them are attainable only to Buddhists. Or it's like in the Upanishads, I mean, you've got Brahman is considered to be the ultimate reality. And then you've got like one or two other Upanishads that's referring to the fourth, which is supposedly even higher than Brahman. It's like, I can't remember what it's called, Upa Brahman, something like that. You know, it's like even higher than ultimate reality somehow. Or like some of these charlatans who have come along over the centuries saying, I'm even higher than a Buddha. But I do think that Nibbana, it has like two aspects. You've got the ethical aspect, which is just the attainment of enlightenment. And then you've got more of the metaphysical aspect of just reality. What is there when you are no longer deluded? You're still conscious and you're not delusional anymore. So, let's see, what's the actual question? So it'd be kind of similar to Tao. There's that chapter, that little part of the Tao Te Ching, from the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, from the two came the 10,000 things. But Tao is like, the original source. And Nibbana, especially from a Mahayana point of view, Theravada really doesn't get that metaphysical with regard to this stuff. That wisely, I think, the Buddha just did not want to reify the absolute. He talked about Nibbana as little as possible. In the Atthakavagga, I can't remember the word Nibbana actually appearing in the entire Atthakavagga. There's like Nibbayadi and Nibbuti, which are like verbs and like a past participle, blowing out and having blown out or being blown out. But that's emphasizing like the ethical, like the practice aspect of attaining the goal and not trying to explain or describe the goal because it's just an exercise in futility. But it's hard to have a goal without thinking about the goal. And so especially like some Mahayana philosophers really took the ball and ran with it and just really were trying to explain sometimes very sophisticated, subtle philosophical language, trying to kind of explain it, but ultimately it just doesn't work. So let's see, what is the descriptions of Nibbana by the Buddha seem to imply that there isn't a reality beyond that. Yeah, it's like Nibbana is the essence and samsara is just perceived forms made up of that essence, but we're not aware of the essence because we're just stuck at the level of form. Okay, so let's see. Nibbana or samsara emerging from the void as a concept seems exactly the same as the Taoist yin-yang differentiation from Wuji emptiness concept, or from the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, from the two came the 10,000 things of samsara. And I guess, the question is, any thoughts on that? And the answer is yeah. Which I did kind of spew some of those thoughts just now. And I'm just going to move on to Cyrus Frame's third question. And I commend all the people who have asked questions by not asking a transgressive fourth one, except possibly the proto-pseudo-monk who just kind of had like a rhetorical question mark towards the beginning. So Cyrus Frame says, I'm very interested in Vedana or feeling tone as an object of mindfulness, particularly regarding the altering of one's perceptions. To me, perception would seem to sit between feeling and craving independent origination. There seems to be major implications here for arresting craving. Do you have any practical advice in regards to working with this in meditation? Well, feeling, like I said half hour ago maybe, it strikes me as just another kind of perception. I think it wound up as one of the links in dependent co-origination, dependent co-arising. From Vedana, it goes straight from feeling to craving. And I agree. As a monk, I used to think there ought to be perception or something right in between feeling and craving, especially back when I was interpreting feeling as just bare sensory data, just bare sensation with no perception added to it yet. But if you look at like prototypes of the 12 links theory, that can be found in various places, like the Sakapanya Sutta of the Digha Nikaya has a kind of proto-dependent co-arising. Also, the Kalaha Vivada Sutta of the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata has like this prototype of the 12 links theory. And sometimes instead of Vedana, it just says pleasant and unpleasant. So craving comes from pleasant and unpleasant. And according to Buddhist philosophy, You've got pleasant feeling and unpleasant feeling. So that's probably the meaning of feeling in the 12 links of dependent core rising in the official formula. It just means like pleasure and pain, or pleasantness and unpleasantness. And that leads to craving, because you've got like this preference. I want the pleasant and I don't want the unpleasant. And so I start like struggling with the way things are. And that's fucking shit up, is what that does. So, yeah, I think that is why it goes directly from feeling to craving, especially if you look at some of the prototypes that can be found in the text, where instead of feeling, it has pleasant, unpleasant, or loved and unloved. And that's what leads to the craving and the suffering. So it's kind of a manner of speaking that the meaning of which kind of got lost to a lot of dogmatic Buddhist philosophical types. So, yeah, if perception would seem to sit between feeling and craving, if you consider feeling to just be like bare sensual data, unprocessed sensory data. But if feeling is like pleasure and pain, pleasantness and unpleasantness, then you could see more of an obvious connection between that and subsequent craving. So let's see here. There seems to be a major implications here for arresting craving. Do you have any practical advice in regards to working with this in meditation? Well, I mean, the way you do it is mainly through mindfulness. Like if you're feeling pleasure and pain, I mean, you observe the pleasure and pain with equanimity, you like philosophical attachment, or the detachment that comes from mindfulness, mindful observation. So you feel pain in your arm, or let's say you're meditating, so you feel pain in your knee. Well, I mean, the natural response to pain is aversion. You know, you want to change position, or you're just like not liking that and being unhappy because you want the pain to stop. The pain in your knee is not the same as suffering. Pain and suffering are not the same. The suffering comes from desiring or craving that pain to be otherwise, wanting it to stop. So the pain in your knee is just sort of like a red light that instinctively or reflexively we want to stop, we want to push it away, but it's not exactly the same. Pain in your knee is just like, it's a feeling that instinctively we automatically have aversion for, but through mindful observance and equanimity, you can sort of cause a detachment between the stimulus and the automatic knee-jerk response. That through like intensive mindfulness, you just observe as it truly is. You just like observe that pain. You know, what does it feel like? You do an intensive meditation retreat where you're all of a sudden, you know, sitting, walking, an hour, you know, hour sitting, hour walking, hour sitting, hour walking all day long. You're going to have all kinds of just excruciating pains, your knee, your ankle, like a certain tiny muscle in your back that only anatomists would know the name of. And it's just like this searing, jabbing pain that you're going through, maybe for a few days until your muscle system restructures enough to accommodate you sitting like straight up and down for hours every day, which you usually don't do. So you got like the dull throbbing pain, you got the sharp jabbing pain, you've got like the twinging, pulsing pain, all these different kinds of pain, and you can just observe them like an ichthyologist observes a dead fish, ideally. And then when you get good at that, I mean, when you're doing that as just a full-time practice, as like a monk, you're just living in a cave, you've just completely simplified your life to the extent where you can really be paying more attention to these just minute things that are happening instead of having to like pay bills and deal with people demanding your attention and all that. You just become a professional meditator, even when you're not sitting cross-legged with your eyes closed. When you're reaching for something, you're aware of the intention to reach, and like the oily feeling in the joints and the feelings of your muscles, and the pressure of your fingers against what it is, and just the urge to like close your fingers to pick it up, and it's all this stuff is going on. And when you're aware of that, it makes it a lot easier to detach, because you're not really identifying with it. It's just stuff that's happening that you're just observing without clinging to it or identifying with it or forming any kind of commentarial interpretation of it. It's just nature taking its course, and you are just the observer. And even if you have to make a decision, you still observe the decision being made. And sometimes that decision may be aversion for pain or attraction to pleasure. You just observe that and do not react. So, that's going with dependent co-origination, the 12 links. It's pleasure and pain lead to craving. That's the main interpretation of it, it seems to me. That it's not really referring to, feeling tone, unless it's in the sense of positive feeling tone and negative feeling tone that you're going to have attraction or aversion for. And like consequent cravings one way or the other. But interested in weighting out or feeling tone as an object of mindfulness. Whatever it is you're feeling. Like the way I was doing Anapana meditation, mindfulness of breathing as a monk, was essentially kind of Vedana-Nupassana, where it's just the sensation of touch at the nostrils or upper lip. But it will get you a long ways. It is a relatively advanced practice, Vedana-Nupassana. It's one of my favorites of like the 4 Satipatthanas. That really, I'm skeptical of even the existence of mindfulness of the body, because the only way you're aware of the body is through feeling and mental states. So I guess I answered that question. I hope I did. And so now for something completely different. Raja Kumara says, why is Jorjani so pro-Israel? That's just right out of left field, isn't it? So Jason Jorjani, he's some Iranian guy who lives in the West, and some of the members of the Discord server are like, watch his videos all the time. I've never seen a single Jason Jorjani video. I don't even know if that's the correct pronunciation of his name. But apparently, Jorjani is pro-Israel at present, even though he's Iranian, because apparently he's like a secular Iranian living in the West. He's not a fundamentalist Shiite Muslim. And so he probably is in favor of the idea of Israel just bombing the current Ayatollah regime of Iran out of existence so that it can go back to a more secular culture like existed under the Shah. So I assume Jason Jorjani is pro-Israel because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Jorjani probably does not like the Ayatollahs, the fundamentalist Shiite government of Iran. And since Israel is the enemy of Iran, Israel is Jorjani's friend. And then on Twitter, he was talking about, or X, Jorjani was talking about how Iran and Israel could become like powerful allies if the current regime can be toppled, and et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to get into all the political stuff, but just that would be my best guess as to why Jorjani, someone that I know very little about, is pro-Israel, because he is a secular Iranian who is against the Ayatollah-led regime in current Iran. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. That's what I'm going to do. And we are kind of getting down towards the bottom, so it'll be less than 3 hours. I'm being a little more long-winded, a little more verbose than usual, I think. Robert says, what is your opinion of using a mala for spiritual practice? Have you ever found it useful? And a mala is like the Buddhist equivalent or the Hindu equivalent of a rosary. It's like a string of beads, a garland of beads with 108 beads. including like the big one, so that when you go all the way through, you hit the big one, you know you've done the full 108. And it's very commonly used among Burmese lay people, especially, or Burmese monks too. Sometimes you'll just see an old monk sitting there with his mala. He'll be just sitting there fingering the mala. And I tried it once. And mainly it was like I was experimenting with seeing if it would be useful for combating sleepiness. Because if you have to keep your thumb moving, then that in itself is going to keep you awake, because it'd be difficult to sleep with your thumb still moving. But it never really appealed to me too much. It was just too busy of a meditation technique that as a monk, I preferred more subtle kinds of meditation where your mind is doing as little as possible, as still and silent as possible. And using a mala it's more suitable for lay people, I think, or sort of beginning level meditation. It could be that there's some advanced mala meditation technique, but I don't know what it would be. So personally, I never really found it useful, although a lot of people do. So I'm not going to badmouth malas here. And I'm just going to move on to Robert's next question. I suppose I should step it up a little bit and not just digress wildly all over the place with every question. So Robert's second question is, do you have any opinions on Tibetan Buddhism, specifically the Kagyu school? Do you think it is a profound system that can lead one to ultimate reality? Well, I'm no authority on Tibetan Buddhism, and I'm not exactly sure what the Kagyu school even is. For those, that wouldn't apply to red hats or yellow hats or anything like that, I assume. But, this question reminds me of a cartoon I saw in a Buddhist magazine many years ago. And it had 3 meditators. It was a Theravada Vipassana meditator, a Zen meditator, and a Tibetan meditator. And the Theravada Vipassana meditator, of course, is like a blonde white woman with like a shawl. She's sitting in, it's like Barre, Massachusetts or something. And she just has like this thought balloon and like an empty thought balloon. She's sitting there in meditation with the standard empty thought balloon. Then next to her, you got the Zen meditator, who is wearing like the gray Zen pajamas. And he's got a thought balloon too, but it's drawn sort of like the Zen circles, like paint, like brush and ink, like India ink or China ink, I guess. And so you got like the calligraphic thought balloon coming out, and it also is empty. And then finally, you've got the Tibetan meditator, who's like a guy in a business suit with like a briefcase sitting next to him. And he's doing Tibetan meditation. And it's sort of like paisley type curlicue shaped thought balloon. First you got the little bubbles that lead up to the big balloon. It's all like these paisley curlicue kind of things. And then the main thought balloon has all this, arabesques all around it, but it also in the middle is empty. So it's just 3 empty thought balloons of 3 meditators in 3 different traditions, all doing essentially the same kind of no thinking. So Tibetan Buddhism definitely, like Dzogchen, for example, it's a profound meditation technique that leads you to like going beyond perception, not relying on perception. That's mainly what Buddhism, or it's mainly what meditation is supposed to do, at least from a Buddhist point of view, in my opinion, is you're calming the waves of perception until you can see through the waves of perception, not be distracted by them anymore. It's like consciousness is water and perception is the waves. Mental states are the waves on the surface of the water. And most people, unenlightened people, are just stuck at the level of waves, the level of form. They have no concept at all of just water. It's just, I like this wave, I don't like that wave. This wave is better than the other wave over there. It's just all waves. It's all mental states. And the underlying consciousness, the substance, the essence of it all, they have no concept of it any more than a fish has a concept that it's wet. So what you do in meditation is you calm the waves. You try to get as close to a flat calm as you can so that there's no waves to distract you. And all there is left to be aware of is just the water itself. And then if you're really good, then after the waves come back, you can still just be operating at the level of water. So that's getting back to Siovakchan Sipat Zidana's question of the enlightened being. You don't have to eliminate the form of desire to be enlightened. It's just that the form is just irrelevant at that point. So if Tibetan Buddhism leads to being wide awake and not thinking anything in its meditation, and then even better yet, after you start thinking and making noise again, that you're still at that same kind of seeing through it all, then that's fine. I've never really practiced Tibetan Buddhism to speak of, and I can't really vouch for how far it gets you, but I would assume there have been enlightened Tibetan Buddhists. So I think it's possible that it is a profound system that possibly can lead one to ultimate reality, like the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, also known as the Yoga of Seeing the Mind in Its Nakedness, is one of the most profound Buddhist texts I've ever read, even though it's Tibetan. It's attributed to Padmasambhava, but whether it really was composed by Padmasambhava or not, I don't know. And I'm just going to move on to Robert's next question. He says, a philosopher named Bernardo Kastrup has proposed a version of idealism, analytic idealism, where there is only one mind at large, and we are basically dissociations of the mind at large. Everything is fundamentally mind, but it is not a subjective idealism like Berkeley, which I have heard you critique before. What are your opinions on this? Yeah, I think it would probably come closer than Berkeley to the truth. It's kind of like my theory, my simile of the block of marble, which, I mean, I've beaten this one to death, where you've got this block of marble, and contained within that block of marble are every possible statue. And some of those statues are so intricate that they become self-referential and start thinking that they are separate from everything else. They start thinking that they're real, even though they're just virtually contained in that block of marble. But the entire statue is already in there. It's really in there, at least in conditional or potential or virtual form. So, I mean, if you want to call the block of marble like pure, like infinite formless consciousness, it's kind of what Vedanta teaches. Even some obscure Buddhist texts, like even Theravada or pre-Theravada Buddhist texts, I mean, they hint at that sometimes. Then sure, you've got infinite formless consciousness, which contains within it every possible form of consciousness, because it's like statues inside this uncarved block. And some of those forms of consciousness are recursive, self-referential, and they just become delusional and just kind of dissociate from the rest of the infinite consciousness. So yeah, what my understanding of the case is not so different from what Bernardo Kastrup seems to think. But that's one way of looking at it, but any kind of model is ultimately invalid, because it's all perception and samsara. You're never going to use ideas to get past samsara into reality, because any kind of idea is of necessity samsaric. There is no highest truth that can be told. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, what do you think of the monks marching for peace to Washington? And yeah, I got asked this one like a month or so ago, back when they were actually marching. To some degree, it's kind of a publicity stunt. I think it's harmless. It's just a way of drawing attention to monks walking for peace, which is kind of a nice idea. I don't think it ended any wars. I don't think it necessarily made the world more peaceful. But I mean, it's monks making a statement of, we're peaceful monks. We're in favor of peace. So this is what we're doing. And it got like a positive response. At least people got to see monks walking around. I mean, one of the 38 blessings of the Mangala Sutta is seeing renunciants. And that was like the thing that Prince Siddhartha Gautama saw that inspired him to renounce the world and eventually become the Buddha. Is he saw a wandering holy man. So, I mean, it's a blessing to people, so long as they're receptive to it, to see wandering holy men or wandering Thai monks. That it's actually a good thing. So in a way, they're putting themselves out there. It's sort of like the rule that monks are required to accept alms food. They can't grow their own food. They can't provide their own food. They have to be fed by lay people. And one of the reasons for that is so that lay people will be exposed to monks and just sort of get an idea of what it's all about. And in the West, you don't have a lot of monks just going for alms in the morning. So just seeing these monks walking for peace to Washington is an opportunity for people to be exposed to these wandering renunciants. So, I mean, all in all, it's harmless at worst. I don't think that they're trying to scam anybody like Varapanya was doing. Maybe just a teensy bit, just getting a few donations. Maybe some of them handle money. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's more good than bad. I mean, it probably didn't really promote world peace all that much, other than just kind of latent, subtle seeds planted in the hearts of hundreds or thousands of people, which may have some vague, subtle influence. But all in all, I've got nothing bad to say about it. And I'm going to move on to PSA's next question, which is, what's the most overrated Buddhist text you've ever read? It could be scripture from Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, other traditions, or modern books written by either monastics or lay people. Well, I mean, there's a number of Mahayana texts that I really consider, I mean, the world would be a better place if they had never been composed. Like, what is it? There's one called the Nirvana Sutra that is just like a cardinal text for like some Pure Land Buddhists, some other Mahayana Buddhists. And if you read it, I mean, it's obviously just a made up fairy tale. I mean, it's teaching what is essentially something the historical Buddha himself would have just denounced. Or what's Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, where you've got this bodhisattva, a layman named Vimalakirti, who is just making fools of the Arahant disciples of the Buddha, and he's going to like taverns and whorehouses and this kind of thing. So, I mean, the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra is one of the better known Mahayana sutras. So texts like that, I mean, they do more harm than good, in my opinion. It's slandering the Buddha's teachings, in my opinion. With regard to like Theravada Buddhist texts, the most overrated. Well, I mean, some of the devotional stuff, like the Ratana Sutta, it's one of the 12 Paritas. It's relatively well known. If anybody has memorized by heart 6 Pali Suttas, the Ratana Sutta, there's a good chance that's among the 6. If they've only memorized one, it's probably like the Metta Sutta or the Mangala Sutta or the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, those cardinal basic ones. But the Ratana Sutta is well known, and it never really spoke to me. It's just devotionalism. There's almost no actual Dhamma in it, even though it's just a basic text, because it's just praising Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with praising Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, but when that's all there is to it, when you're not even getting into any kind of philosophy to be praised, then, it's just devotionalism. It's just kind of worshipy, and I would consider it to be overrated. With regard to larger texts, like the Jataka stories, I mean, there's a lot of silliness, just flat out silliness in the Jataka stories. And again, it's just getting into devotionalism. I mean, probably the best use of Jataka stories is it's sort of like Aesop's fables for Buddhists, where you learn at least about, I mean, it's kind of entertaining stories, and you learn about ancient India, what it was like living in ancient India, that kind of thing. The Visuddhimagga, in my opinion, is overrated. It's like the central text in the Theravada commentarial tradition. And it seems to me that it's mainly a manual on self-hypnosis. There is some interesting stuff. Like there's one chapter, one of the early chapters is just going over the 13 Dhutangas, the optional ascetic practices. The chapter before that, if I remember correctly, is just the value of morality. Basic stuff like that is interesting. The 32 parts of the body, there's a chapter going over the 32 parts of the body. You just see plainly enough that they really were ignorant of human anatomy and physiology in those days. They had no concept of what the brain was for example. So, yeah, the most overrated Theravada Buddhist text, maybe the Visuddhimagga. I mean, it does have some valuable information and you can learn stuff from it, but it is kind of unfortunate to me that it is like the central text that defines Theravada Buddhism. Or the Ratana Sutta. I mean, there's quite a few kind of famous suttas that don't really have much substance to them. And so I don't consider their cardinal status to be really well warranted. But it's not like I'm saying they're bad or anything. I'm just saying that they're overrated. And so I move on to PSA's third question, which is the last question of this Q&A, finally, for the two of you that are still watching. And he says, same question as question 2, but underrated instead of overrated. Well, with regard to Tibetan Buddhism, I mean, the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, the yoga of knowing the mind in its nakedness, I mean, that's well worth reading, even though probably most Buddhists have never heard of it. With regard to Mahayana Buddhism, like non-Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism, I don't know what the most underrated. I mean, probably there's some real gems in the zillion gajillion volumes of the Mahayana Tripitaka, but I'm not exactly sure what they would be because I'm not an authority and I've probably never heard of them. But with regard to Theravada, I mean, that's pretty obvious of an answer for me would be the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata. Just the Sutta Nipata in general is, I mean, it used to be just cardinal basic texts that just gradually faded into obscurity. Like a number of the suttas that Ashoka recommended for study in his edicts were from the Sutta Nipata. But the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, I mean, a lot of Buddhists have never heard of it. And a lot of Theravada Buddhists, like in Burma, they just know the basic ones that are well known, kind of like the mainstream texts. But something like the Atthakavagga, it's kind of an embarrassment to Orthodox Theravada because it's not Orthodox. It's like pre-Orthodox. So, it's just kind of awkward. It doesn't really fit in to the well-established system of orthodoxy in Theravada, but in my opinion, it is potentially at least the most important document in existence on this planet that we know of. Who knows, they might dig up something in Central Asia that's even more just groundbreaking or something. But the Atthakavagga, it's probably the largest fragment of archaic pre-Theravada Buddhism still in existence. Which is one reason why I translated it. At the time, I really didn't have access to a good translation. Ajahn Thanissaro and Bhikkhu Bodhi hadn't translated it yet. At least it wasn't published by them yet. So I made my own translation. Just because I consider it to be so important. I mean, it's just like I say, the largest extant fragment of like primitive, archaic Buddhism still in existence. And it's grotesquely underrated just based on that assessment of mine. And so that's it. I'm done. I answered all the questions, I hope. Or at least tried to answer all the questions. So, like I should always say at the beginning and pretty much never do, if you think I could answer a question of yours, Mainly about Dhamma, philosophical stuff, anything that you think I can answer. You can even ask about evolutionary biology if you want, I guess. Just feel free to leave them in the comments below this video. No more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And feel free to check out the URL links below, which includes the Amazon link to my new book. And what else? Like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be happy. And now I'm going to push this button, which is going to make me stop talking.